The story opens in 2004, in one of the most remote places imaginable, Antarctica. Down here, civilization might as well be on another planet. There are no streets, no buildings, and almost nothing resembling ordinary life. Just a seemingly endless sheet of ice, brutal cold, and silence stretching toward the horizon. Working out on the enormous Larsen ice shelf is a small scientific expedition led by Jack Hall, a paleoclimatologist who specializes in reconstructing Earth's climate from the distant past. Joining him are two colleagues he knows well, Frank Harris, his veteran research partner, and Jason Evans, the man responsible for the team's drilling operations. Their mission involves boring deep beneath the frozen surface and extracting ancient columns of ice known as ice cores. These frozen samples are essentially natural archives. Buried inside them are microscopic pockets of air sealed away centuries or even thousands of years earlier. By analyzing those trapped gases, Jack can piece together what Earth's atmosphere looked like long ago. The idea is straightforward. Understand how the climate changed before, and scientists may have a better chance of recognizing what is coming next. Normally, this kind of fieldwork is slow and methodical. Today is different. Jason is operating the drilling equipment outside when a vibration suddenly passes through the ice. At first, it seems minor, but within moments the entire shelf begins trembling beneath them. Then a black fracture tears across the white landscape. The crack races forward with frightening speed, cutting directly toward their position. There is barely enough time to react before an enormous section of the shelf separates and starts breaking apart. Jack finds himself stranded on the opposite side from Frank and Jason, with the newly formed chasm widening between them by the second. Standing still isn't an option. Jack charges toward the gap and throws himself across with everything he has. For a moment, it looks as though he might make it. Then the ice beneath him crumbles. He drops. Just before disappearing into the abyss, Jack manages to drive his ice axe into the edge. Now he is hanging over the open fracture with nothing beneath him but darkness. Frank and Jason scramble toward him, grab hold, and manage to haul him back onto solid ground. Once Jack is safe, all three men stare into the enormous opening. Nobody says much. The fracture plunges farther down than they can see, and this isn't some isolated break running a few yards across the shelf. The damage extends across an astonishing distance through Antarctica. Whatever caused it, the scale is enough to make the scientists uneasy. It is almost as though the planet has just delivered its first warning. Not long afterward, Jack leaves the Antarctic ice behind and travels to New Delhi, India, where a United Nations climate conference is underway. The room is filled with researchers, politicians, government representatives, and international officials, all gathered to debate the growing threat of global warming. Jack takes the floor to explain a mechanism that most people in the room cannot afford to ignore: the vast circulation system moving heat through the world's oceans, particularly the current carrying warm water into the North Atlantic. He breaks the science down into simple terms. Warm ocean water originating closer to the equator travels northward, transporting tremendous amounts of heat with it. That moving warmth plays a major role in keeping large parts of the northern hemisphere, especially Europe and North America, considerably milder than they otherwise would be. But the circulation depends on a delicate physical process. As seawater moves farther north, it becomes colder and remains salty. Cold, salty water is dense, so eventually it sinks deep into the ocean. That downward movement helps pull more water through the system, maintaining a gigantic circulation loop driven by differences in temperature and salinity. The problem, Jack explains, is that global temperatures are rising. Glaciers and major ice formations are melting at an accelerating rate, releasing huge quantities of fresh water into the sea. Unlike salty ocean water, this fresh water is less dense. It resists sinking in the same way. Add enough of it to the North Atlantic and the balance begins to collapse. If the water can no longer sink properly, the circulation could weaken dramatically or even shut down. And without that steady transport of tropical heat toward the north, temperatures across much of the northern hemisphere could plunge. The terrifying part is the speed. Instead of Earth simply becoming warmer year after year, the disruption could push northern regions in the opposite direction. Temperatures might collapse rapidly enough to trigger conditions resembling another ice age. Jack warns the delegates that continued dependence on fossil fuels is increasing the danger. In his view, this isn't necessarily a catastrophe waiting several thousand years in the future. The consequences could arrive within the lifetime of the next generation. Before he can fully make his case, however, U.S. Vice President Raymond Baker interrupts. Baker focuses immediately on the economic consequences of Jack's proposal. Taking aggressive action against climate change, he argues, could cost billions. With the economy already facing pressure, he he considers such measures unrealistic. Jack doesn't back away. He tells Baker that refusing to act could eventually cost far more than prevention ever would. The vice president remains unconvinced. To him, Jack's prediction sounds exaggerated and alarmist. He brushes the warning aside and leaves the discussion. Outside the conference building, demonstrators have gathered with signs demanding action on climate change. Moving through the crowd, Jack runs into Professor Terry Rapson, a highly regarded climatologist who operates a major climate research facility in Scotland. The two scientists clearly share many of the same concerns. Rather than remain around the conference, they head off together to continue their discussion privately. But while officials are still debating whether Jack's warning deserves to be taken seriously, nature is already beginning to behave strangely. Far out over the Pacific, atmospheric conditions start changing. The sky grows violent, as though an enormous disturbance is developing above the ocean. Thousands of miles away, at Professor Rapson's Climate Research Center in Scotland, his staff continues its routine monitoring of the North Atlantic. Two researchers, Dennis and Simon, are watching data arriving from a network of ocean buoys. Positioned across the Atlantic, these instruments repeatedly measure water temperature and transmit fresh readings back to the facility. Then one of the buoys reports something extraordinary. The ocean temperature has suddenly fallen by 13 degrees. The number makes no sense, a change that severe shouldn't happen under normal conditions, so Simon assumes the instrument has malfunctioned. Dennis reaches the same conclusion. One defective sensor isn't particularly unusual, and initially they decide there is nothing worth panicking about. Then another buoy sends in nearly the same reading, and then a third. By the time Professor Rapson returns and examines the incoming data himself, the possibility of a simple equipment failure becomes difficult to believe. One buoy can malfunction. Even two might be explained away. But three independent instruments recording the same dramatic temperature collapse at roughly the same time. That means the sensors probably aren't the problem. The Atlantic itself is changing. At almost the same time, another bizarre event unfolds halfway around the planet. Tokyo is experiencing what begins as an ordinary rainstorm. People move through the city expecting nothing more serious than wet streets and umbrellas. Then chunks of ice begin dropping from the clouds. These aren't normal hailstones. They are enormous, some approaching the size of footballs, and they hammer into the city with devastating force. Cars, windows, rooftops, and streets are struck within seconds. Pedestrians barely have time to understand what is falling before the giant pieces of ice come crashing down around them. For some, there is no chance to escape. People are killed almost immediately as the freak storm tears through the city. Back in the United States, Jack returns home to Washington, D.C., where the climate crisis briefly gives way to problems inside his own family. He speaks with his wife, Lucy, a physician, and she brings up their teenage son, Sam. Apparently, Sam has recently failed a test, something neither parent would normally expect from a kid as intelligent as he is. But there is something else Jack needs to know. The following day, Sam is leaving Washington for New York City, where he will represent his school in an academic quiz competition. Jack tells Sam he will personally take him to the airport the next morning. Before that, though, Jack has to report back to work at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The moment he arrives, his supervisor, Tom Gomez, calls him in, and it is obvious he is furious. Tom has already heard about what happened at the climate conference in New Delhi. From his perspective, Jack publicly challenged the Vice President of the United States and made their entire department look confrontational. He warns Jack that political consequences could follow, including cuts to the funding that keeps their climate research alive. Jack hears him, but his mind is somewhere else. At that moment, government politics are not his biggest concern. He promised his son a ride, and he is already running short on time. So Jack leaves the office, takes Sam to the airport, and sees him off. Sam is traveling to New York City with two classmates. One of them is Brian, his close friend. The other is Laura Chapman, a girl Sam obviously likes, even if he has never quite managed to tell her how he feels. The three teenagers board their flight and head toward Manhattan, unaware that events much larger than any school competition are already unfolding around the planet. Hundreds of kilometers above them, astronauts aboard the International Space Station are looking down at Earth through the station's windows. What they see is unlike anything they have witnessed before. Enormous storm formations are beginning to spin across the atmosphere. These systems are not confined to a single region or coastline. They stretch over vast sections of the planet, covering areas the size of countries and even continents. From orbit, their scale is terrifying. Down on Earth, attention suddenly shifts toward Los Angeles. At a weather monitoring facility, an urgent call comes in reporting bizarre conditions along the coast. Hail is pounding the beaches, with chunks of ice reaching roughly the size of golf balls. The technician receiving the report immediately contacts his superior, Bard. At first, Bard simply walks outside onto his balcony to see the weather for himself. Then he freezes. In the distance, a tornado is beginning to form directly over the city, and it isn't alone. Within minutes, several tornadoes have touched down across Los Angeles at the same time. The city descends into chaos. Bard manages to get into a helicopter and begins recording what is happening below. News networks quickly pick up the live footage, broadcasting the destruction across the country. Millions of people watch as Los Angeles is torn apart. One of the tornadoes charges through Hollywood and rips directly into the famous Hollywood sign. The giant letters are torn from the hillside and hurled through the air as though they weigh nothing. Cars and trucks are lifted from the streets and tossed across intersections. Roofs are peeled away. Windows explode. Entire sections of buildings buckle under the wind. Back at the weather office, Jack and Tom stand in front of a television, stunned by the images coming out of California. Then the situation becomes even worse. Two of the tornadoes converge and combine into a much larger funnel. The gigantic storm moves toward Los Angeles International Airport, tearing through the area with incredible force. By this point, the city has already suffered catastrophic damage, but nature is not finished. The earth suddenly begins to move. An earthquake strikes Los Angeles while the tornado disaster is still unfolding. Buildings that survived the wind begin collapsing under the shaking. Roads split apart. Debris crashes into the streets, and people already trying to escape the storm are caught in an entirely new disaster. A television journalist reporting live from the scene continues speaking into the camera as the destruction unfolds behind her. Then a massive billboard breaks loose. It crashes down directly onto her, killing her while the broadcast is still live. By the time the combined disasters finally pass, Los Angeles is essentially devastated. The federal government reacts immediately. President Blake orders a nationwide suspension of air travel until authorities can determine what is happening. That decision creates another problem. Sam, Laura, and Brian are now stranded in New York. With every flight grounded, there is no simple way for them to return to Washington. Back at the National Weather Center, confusion dominates the room. Meteorologists, scientists, and government officials are all searching for an explanation. Some begin wondering whether unusual solar activity could be interfering with Earth's atmosphere. NASA meteorologist Janet Takata examines the available measurements. It takes her only a short time to eliminate that possibility. The sun is behaving normally. There are no abnormal solar flares or disturbances powerful enough to explain what is happening. Jack realizes the moment has come to say what nobody in the room wants to hear. He steps forward and tells them that the disasters are connected to the process he warned about in New Delhi. The North Atlantic circulation system has been disrupted. The balance between fresh water and salt water has changed so dramatically that the current responsible for transporting heat northward is beginning to fail. As that circulation weakens, huge parts of the northern hemisphere are losing their normal supply of oceanic heat. The violent storms appearing around the planet are not random events, they are symptoms. According to Jack, Earth is beginning the transition toward another ice age. The entire room falls silent. Most of the people standing there had probably considered his earlier warnings theoretical. Now cities are being destroyed. After the meeting, Janet approaches Jack privately. Unlike the others, she believes his explanation fits the data. More importantly, she wants to help determine what comes next. Jack, Janet, Frank, and Jason immediately begin working together. They spend the night going through temperature readings, atmospheric data, ocean measurements, and climate equations. Nobody gets much rest. Hour after hour, they build a model designed to estimate how quickly the climate system is collapsing. Eventually, the calculations produce an answer. They hand Jack the results on a single sheet of paper. He studies the numbers. They are worse than anyone expected. According to the model, the northern hemisphere could enter full ice age conditions within approximately 6 to 8 weeks. While Jack is staring at that prediction, conditions in New York continue deteriorating. Rain has been falling over the city relentlessly. Sam manages to call his father and explains that he and the others cannot return home because transportation across the country has been shut down. He tries to reassure Jack, telling him they will be fine. A student named James, who belongs to a rival academic team, offers them somewhere to stay. James also happens to be clearly interested in Laura. Sam notices immediately. He doesn't exactly love the idea of staying at the apartment of a guy who is flirting with the girl he likes, but circumstances leave them with few alternatives. Back in Washington, Jack stops worrying about professional consequences. Armed with the new model, he goes directly to Vice President Baker. This time, Jack is not asking for further discussion. He urges the government to begin evacuating every major population center across the northern states before conditions become impossible. Millions of people could be trapped if authorities wait too long. Once again, Baker refuses to accept Jack's conclusions. He tells Jack to keep his theories to himself and walks away. While politicians argue in Washington, Europe is already being overwhelmed. A blizzard has been raging across the continent for an entire day without stopping. Snow is burying cities, highways, and countryside beneath an expanding frozen landscape. But the snow itself isn't even the greatest danger. Inside the storm, an extraordinary atmospheric phenomenon has developed. Extremely cold air from the upper atmosphere is being pulled downward in powerful vortices. These descending pockets of air are so cold that anything exposed to them can freeze almost immediately. The situation becomes serious enough that 3 military helicopters are dispatched on an emergency mission to rescue members of the British royal family. The aircraft fly directly into the storm. Almost immediately, visibility disappears. The pilots can barely see beyond their windscreens. Then the temperature plunges. The cold becomes so extreme that the helicopter systems and instruments begin freezing. One after another, all 3 aircraft lose control and crash. At least one pilot survives the initial impact. He forces his way out of the wreckage and crawls into the open. That turns out to be fatal. Within moments, the exposed cold overwhelms him. His body freezes where he stands. In Scotland, Professor Terry Rapson realizes they are witnessing something far beyond an ordinary extreme weather event. He contacts Jack immediately and sends him everything his research center has collected. The 2 scientists compare their findings and finally understand the scale of the disaster. A colossal superstorm is developing across the northern hemisphere. At the center of this system, the pressure difference is pulling frigid upper atmospheric air directly toward the surface. Where those pockets descend, temperatures fall with astonishing speed. Anyone caught outside during that temperature collapse could freeze within minutes. Terry then delivers another piece of terrible news. Based on his calculations, Scotland has perhaps 48 hours remaining before it becomes completely overwhelmed. The larger storm systems are likely to continue for approximately 7 days. When they finally weaken, the northern hemisphere will no longer resemble the world people knew before. The ice age will have begun. Jack immediately tells Terry to evacuate. There is a short silence on the other end of the call. Terry already knows what Jack has not yet accepted. Leaving is no longer possible. In a quiet voice, he tells Jack that, for those in Scotland, the opportunity to escape has already passed. Meanwhile, New York is rapidly turning into a disaster zone. The non-stop rain has overwhelmed the drainage system. Water begins surging back up through street drains. Intersections disappear beneath the flooding. Subway stations fill as torrents pour underground, turning tunnels into rivers. Sam, Laura, Brian, James, and the others realize they need to reach higher ground before they become trapped. James says he knows somewhere safer. He leads the group through the flooded streets toward the New York Public Library, a massive stone structure that should provide better protection than the surrounding buildings. As they hurry through Manhattan, something strange catches their attention above the city. Thousands upon thousands of birds are filling the sky. Every one of them is flying in the same direction, south, as fast as they possibly can. At the city zoo, the animals have become completely frantic. Their cries echo through the streets, as though they can sense the danger approaching before the people do. Then Laura spots something horrifying. A family is trapped inside a car while floodwater rises rapidly around the vehicle. The doors are jammed, the water is climbing, and they are running out of time. Laura immediately stops to help them. That delay nearly costs her everything. Out near the harbor, the water suddenly begins to rise. A gigantic surge forms beside the Statue of Liberty. Within seconds, the monument is engulfed by the wall of water. The wave keeps building as it races directly toward Manhattan. Sam turns and realizes Laura is still behind him. He runs back through the chaos, reaches her, grabs her hand, and the two sprint toward safety. Then the wave reaches the city. It crashes through the streets with terrifying force. Cars disappear beneath the water. Buildings vanish behind the surge. Entire blocks are swallowed almost instantly, and thousands of people are killed before they even have a chance to react. Sam and Laura barely reach the doors of the New York Public Library before the flood slams into the building. Water bursts through the lower level, filling the first floor, but everyone who managed to reach the upper sections survives the initial impact. For the moment they are alive, down in the basement, Sam discovers an old payphone partially submerged in water. Somehow it still works. He calls home. When Jack answers and hears his son's voice, the relief in his face is immediate. But there is no time for a long conversation. Jack tells Sam to listen closely. Another storm is coming, and this one will be far worse than the flood. Temperatures are expected to collapse so quickly that anything exposed outside could freeze within minutes. Sam must stay inside the library. No matter what happens, he must not leave. He needs to keep everyone warm and wait. Jack promises him one thing: he is coming to New York. Sam agrees and tells his father he will stay where he is. The moment the call ends, Jack tells Lucy what he intends to do. He is going after their son. Lucy does not argue. She knows there is no point trying to stop him. This is no longer about being a scientist. Jack is simply a father trying to reach his child. Before he can leave, though, Tom intercepts him with unexpected news. The political situation has changed completely. After everything that has happened, the president is finally ready to hear Jack directly. Jack is taken to the White House, where President Blake, senior military officers, and government officials are waiting. Using a large map of the United States, Jack explains what must be done. The northern part of the country is already beyond realistic evacuation. There simply isn't enough time. Once the extreme temperature drop reaches those areas, anyone caught outside will die almost immediately. Trying to move millions of people from the far north now would only create more casualties. The population that still has a chance must head south, as far south as possible. Ideally, people need to cross into Mexico before the superstorm reaches them, and they need to start moving immediately. Vice President Baker once again questions Jack's conclusions. This time, however, President Blake refuses to let the argument continue. He approves Jack's recommendation. Emergency evacuation orders are issued across the United States. Almost overnight, highways become packed with millions of people trying to move south. The migration becomes so enormous that the Mexican border is overwhelmed. Mexican authorities initially consider sealing the crossings. The United States is now facing the possibility that its own population could be trapped at the border while the storm closes in. President Blake negotiates directly. The American government offers to cancel the debts owed by Latin American nations in return for allowing refugees from the United States to cross freely into Mexico. An agreement is reached. The border opens. While much of Washington empties, Lucy remains at the hospital. Nearly all patients have already been evacuated, but one child cannot safely be moved. The boy is seriously ill, and transporting him without a properly equipped ambulance could kill him. Lucy refuses to abandon him. She tells the final nurse to leave while there is still time. Then she stays behind alone with the boy, hoping emergency transportation arrives before the weather becomes impossible. Meanwhile, Jack gets ready to begin the journey north. He turns toward Frank, expecting to say goodbye. Instead, Frank is already dressed in cold-weather gear with his pack ready. He makes it clear that Jack is not doing this alone. Frank has spent 2 decades looking out for him, and he has no intention of quitting now. Before Jack can respond, Jason enters carrying his own equipment. He jokes that neither Jack nor Frank has enough sense of direction to reach New York without him. So the decision is made. All 3 of them are going. Janet remains behind in Washington, monitoring the storm systems and passing them whatever information she can. Jack, Frank, and Jason load a truck with Arctic survival equipment and start driving north. The farther they travel, the worse the weather becomes. Snow falls harder, visibility shrinks. Eventually, the world outside the windshield becomes almost completely white. Still, they keep moving. Then they encounter a tractor-trailer that has jackknifed across the road, blocking the route entirely. There is no way around it. The truck can take them no farther. They unload their gear, strap snowshoes onto their boots, and continue toward New York on foot. Because visibility is nearly zero, the 3 men tie themselves together with a rope. If one person becomes separated in the storm, they could disappear only a few meters away and never find each other again. They move carefully through the blizzard. At one point, Jack notices that the surface beneath his feet feels different. It is smoother than the snow-covered ground they have been crossing, but with the storm hiding everything around them, none of the men can tell what is underneath. Then the surface breaks. The 3 men drop. Jack reacts quickly and drives his ice axe into something solid, stopping his fall. Jason manages to grab hold as well. Frank is not so lucky. He is hanging below them, suspended only by the rope connecting the 3 men. As the snow shifts, they finally understand where they are. They have been walking across the glass roof of a shopping mall completely buried beneath the accumulated snow. The glass beneath Jack and Jason is already cracking. With Frank hanging from the rope, his weight is pulling on both of them. Every second makes the fracture spread farther. Frank looks upward at his friends, then he looks at the breaking glass. He understands what will happen if he stays attached. All three of them will fall. Before Jack can stop him, Frank reaches for the rope. He cuts himself loose. Jack and Jason shout his name, but Frank disappears into the darkness below. Back in Manhattan, the survivors inside the library are struggling to stay warm. The building offers shelter, but without enough heat, that shelter will not matter for long. Sam realizes they need fuel. He tells everyone to collect books from around the library and bring them into the main reading room. Soon, people are stacking books beside the enormous fireplace and feeding them into the flames. For once, preserving the collection is less important than surviving the night. Then someone listening to a radio hears a disturbing report. Europe has reportedly been buried beneath roughly 5 meters of snow. The news sends panic through the room. Some of the survivors decide they cannot remain inside any longer. They believe their best chance is to walk south while they still can. The floodwater outside has frozen over, creating a vast white surface across the streets, and they think they can cross it on foot and escape the city. Sam desperately tries to convince them otherwise. He tells them his father is a climate scientist. Jack specifically warned him that once the extreme cold arrives, anyone outside will freeze before they can reach safety. Sam begs the group to remain in the library, but fear has already taken over. They ignore him. Several people leave the building and begin walking south across the frozen city. By the following morning, a new problem appears. Laura will not wake properly. Her body is trembling and she is burning with fever. Sam examines the injury she suffered during the flood. The wound on her leg has become badly infected. Without antibiotics, the infection could spread quickly. She might lose the leg. She could even die. Sam looks through the library window at the frozen streets outside. Not far away sits a huge cargo vessel. The flood carried the ship deep into Manhattan, where it became trapped when the water froze. Sam realizes something. A ship that size should have a medical supply room. If there are antibiotics anywhere nearby, they might be on board. He decides to go. Brian and James immediately volunteer to accompany him. The three boys make their way across the frozen city and reach the stranded ship. They climb aboard and begin searching. Eventually, they locate the medical room. Unfortunately, the door is locked. Sam finds another way in. He goes outside, carefully moves along the ship's exterior, reaches a window, smashes through it, and climbs into the room from the other side. Once inside, he unlocks the door for Brian and James. They begin checking the supplies. Brian finds what they need, penicillin. With the medicine secured, they decide to search the ship's kitchen for food before heading back. The library's supplies will not last forever, and anything edible could help. They move deeper into the darkened vessel. Then they hear something, a faint sound from somewhere in the corridor. They stop. Something else is inside the ship. The danger inside the stranded ship finally reveals itself. The wolves that escaped from the zoo during the flooding have made their way through the frozen city, and now they have followed the boys' scent straight onto the vessel. They move almost without making a sound. Before James can react, one of the animals lunges and clamps onto his leg. Sam grabs the nearest heavy object and swings hard, forcing the wolf away long enough for them to escape. The three boys race down the corridor and throw themselves into another room, slamming the door behind them. For a few seconds, nobody speaks. James is injured, the wolves are still somewhere outside, and they are running out of time. Then Sam looks through a window and notices something even more frightening. The sky over New York has changed. The center of the superstorm is moving across the city. That means the catastrophic temperature plunge Jack warned him about is almost here. They have only minutes. Sam knows they cannot stay trapped on the ship. He makes a risky decision. He climbs through a window and deliberately draws the wolves toward himself, giving Brian and James a chance to move. The animals chase him through the frozen passages of the ship. Sam runs as fast as he can, using the narrow corridors to stay ahead of them. At the right moment, he slips through a heavy metal doorway and manages to lock the wolves on the other side. Brian and James now have a clear path out. Carrying the penicillin and whatever food they manage to collect, they leave the ship and race toward the library. Sam catches up with them. Behind them, the deep freeze begins spreading through Manhattan. It moves almost like an invisible wall. Buildings frost over in seconds. Cars turn white. Streetlights and metal poles become coated in ice almost instantly. Everything touched by the descending cold seems to crystallize where it stands. The boys run harder. They reach the library just ahead of the freezing air, burst through the entrance, and slam the doors behind them. But the lobby is not warm enough. They sprint deeper into the building toward the room with the fireplace. Once everyone is inside, they shut that door as well. Outside, the freezing air sweeps through the library. The corridors go silent. Ice creeps across walls and floors. Within moments, everything beyond the room turns pale and motionless. Inside, however, the flames continue burning. That small fire is enough to keep them alive. Far from New York, Jack and Jason are still forcing their way through the storm. They refuse to stop. The journey has taken everything out of them, and eventually Jason's body gives up. He collapses from exhaustion in the snow. Jack grabs him and keeps moving, dragging him across the frozen ground rather than leaving him behind. Then Jack notices the weather changing around them. The eye of the superstorm is approaching their position too. He knows what comes next. Temperatures are about to drop beyond anything they can survive outside. Through the snow, Jack spots a roof vent protruding from beneath the surface. It is their only chance. He gets Jason to the opening and forces him through first. Then Jack dives in after him just as the freezing air reaches them. They shelter below the surface while the worst of the storm passes overhead. Hours go by. Eventually Jason wakes. Jack is sitting nearby, still waiting. Jason barely has the strength to speak, but the first thing he says is that they cannot remain there. Sam is still waiting for them, so they gather what energy they have left and continue. When they return outside, the storm has left something horrifying behind. Ahead of them are the people who abandoned the library and tried to walk south. They never made it. Their bodies are frozen across the street, some of them still positioned, as though they were taking another step when the cold overtook them. There are dozens. Sam had been right to stay inside. Later that night, Jack and Jason take shelter inside their tent. The world outside is almost completely silent. Jason eventually asks the question that has been hanging over everything since the disaster began. Does Jack really think humanity can survive something this enormous? Jack considers it carefully. Humans survived an ice age once before, he tells him. This time they have science, technology, and centuries of accumulated knowledge that their ancestors never had. If humanity has actually learned something from the mistakes that helped create this catastrophe, Jack believes there is still a chance. Jason then asks about Sam. Jack's answer comes immediately. He gave his son his word. He said he would come for him. As far as Jack is concerned, that promise is not negotiable. Back in Washington, the nation's capital has become a ghost city. The streets are empty. The White House has been abandoned. Government buildings sit dark beneath the snow. President Blake and the remaining leadership are traveling south in a convoy toward Mexico, but somewhere along the route, the superstorm catches them. The convoy does not make it through. President Blake is killed. That leaves Vice President Raymond Baker to assume the presidency. The same man who repeatedly rejected Jack's warnings is now forced to confront exactly what those warnings were trying to prevent. After being sworn in, Baker addresses the public from Mexico City. This time, his message is very different. He openly acknowledges that the climate scientists were correct. The disaster they predicted has happened. He promises that the government will now commit every available resource to finding and rescuing survivors who remain trapped throughout the frozen northern states. At the hospital, Lucy is still protecting the sick child she refused to abandon. Eventually, a rescue team reaches the building. They are able to move both Lucy and the boy safely south. For the first time since the evacuation began, Jack's family is no longer in immediate danger. High above Earth, the astronauts aboard the space station notice another major change. The enormous storm formations that have dominated the northern hemisphere are beginning to weaken. Their rotation slows. Cloud layers start breaking apart. Gradually, patches of the surface become visible again. After days of watching the planet disappear beneath violent weather systems, the astronauts can finally see Earth clearly. One of them quietly remarks on something else. The atmosphere looks extraordinarily clean. Back on the surface, Jack emerges from the shelter. The blizzard is gone. The sky above him is pale blue. There is almost no wind. After days of roaring storms, the silence feels unnatural. Jack and Jason start walking again. Several hours later, they finally reach what should be New York City, but almost nothing looks familiar. The entire landscape has been transformed. Ships carried inland by the flood are frozen between skyscrapers. Roads have vanished beneath ice and snow. Buildings rise out of the white surface like ruins from another world. Jack checks his GPS. According to the coordinates, the New York Public Library should be directly beneath them. The building has been almost completely buried. They begin digging. Eventually, they uncover a way inside. Jack enters first. The corridors are dark and bitterly cold. He moves slowly through the building, calling Sam's name and listening for any response. For a while there is nothing, then he notices something. A faint light is escaping from underneath one of the doors. Jack approaches it. He pushes the door open. Inside, a fire is still burning. Around it are the survivors. Laura is there, weak from her infection but conscious. Brian is alive, James is alive, and then Jack sees Sam. For a moment, neither father nor son says anything. Sam simply gets up and runs toward him. Jack catches him. After everything they have survived, no explanation is needed. The embrace between them says more than words could. Far to the south, Tom receives the news and immediately takes it to President Baker. Jack Hall has reached Manhattan. There are survivors inside New York. The government reacts at once. Rescue helicopters are prepared and sent north. They fly over thousands of kilometers of frozen terrain toward a city that has almost disappeared beneath the ice. As the helicopters approach Manhattan, Tom looks down through the window. At first, he sees only white streets and frozen buildings. Then he notices movement. Small figures are walking across the ice below. Survivors have heard the helicopters and are coming out of hiding. The aircraft descend and begin picking them up. Once airborne again, the crews notice more people. Some survivors had climbed onto rooftops and remained there, wading through the entire storm. The helicopters move from building to building, rescuing everyone they can find. From the air, New York no longer resembles the city it once was. It looks like a frozen landscape from another planet. Above them, the astronauts continue watching Earth. The superstorms have finally disappeared. The atmosphere appears clearer than it has in years. One astronaut looks down and quietly asks the others whether they have ever seen the air look so clean. The planet they are looking at is permanently changed. Millions of people are gone. Entire regions have been buried beneath snow and ice. Countries have been devastated, and countless lives can never be recovered. Yet humanity has not disappeared. Some people endured, some found shelter, some crossed borders, others risked everything to save the people they loved. And after ignoring warning after warning, the survivors are left with one final question. Now that the world has shown them the cost of refusing to listen, will humanity finally remember the lesson? At its core, The Day After Tomorrow starts with a simple but powerful idea. What if humanity's warnings about climate change were ignored until it was too late? The story introduces us to Jack Hall, a climatologist who has spent years studying the effects of global warming. He believes the planet is heading toward a dangerous turning point, but when he tries to warn world leaders, his concerns are mostly dismissed. The interesting part of the setup is that the movie doesn't begin with an obvious villain. There's no alien invasion, no terrorist threat, no enemy to fight. The threat is nature itself, a planet reacting to years of damage caused by human activity. Of course, this is where the film immediately takes a very Hollywood approach. Instead of showing gradual environmental changes over decades, it accelerates everything into a nightmare scenario that happens almost overnight. The world goes from climate concern to complete disaster mode, with massive storms, freezing temperatures, and entire cities being transformed by extreme weather. And that exaggeration is both the movie's biggest strength and its biggest weakness. As a blockbuster idea, it's incredibly effective. The thought of modern civilization suddenly becoming vulnerable against the forces of nature is a genuinely fascinating concept. Skyscrapers, highways, and advanced technology, all the things that represent human control, suddenly become useless when the environment turns hostile. But at the same time, the movie pushes the science so far that it becomes difficult to take the scenario seriously. The speed of the climate changes, the scale of the freezing, and the way the disaster unfolds are clearly designed more for cinematic impact than scientific realism. Still, the basic premise works because it gives the movie a different kind of disaster story. Unlike many films where characters are trying to stop an outside threat, here the characters are simply trying to survive the consequences of something much bigger than themselves. The personal side of the story comes through Jack's search for his son Sam, who is trapped in New York as the disaster unfolds. That father-son element gives the movie a more familiar emotional anchor. While the world is collapsing around them, the story keeps returning to one simple motivation: a father refusing to give up on his child. Whether the film fully succeeds with that emotional angle is another question, but the foundation is strong. A scientist predicting a catastrophe that nobody believes, a world forced to face the consequences of its actions, and a desperate race against time. These are all ingredients that could create a very powerful disaster thriller. The Day After Tomorrow takes that idea and turns the volume all the way up. It isn't interested in subtle warnings or realistic predictions. It wants to show the biggest possible version of the nightmare, where nature completely overwhelms human civilization. And even if the science is questionable, there's something undeniably compelling about watching a movie ask a simple question: what happens when the planet stops forgiving us? One of the most interesting things about The Day After Tomorrow is that underneath all the destruction and CGI spectacle, the movie is actually trying to say something. It's not just about cities freezing over or people running from storms. At its heart, it's a warning about how human actions can push the environment toward a dangerous point. The film came out at a time when climate change was becoming a much bigger public conversation, and it clearly wanted audiences to think about the consequences of ignoring environmental problems. The message is pretty straightforward. If we continue damaging the planet and refuse to take warnings seriously, eventually there will be consequences. And honestly, that idea still gives the movie some relevance. The problem is that the film's message is delivered with the same level of exaggeration as its disasters. Instead of presenting climate change as a slow, complicated process, it turns it into a sudden global emergency where the world changes within days. That makes the movie easier to understand from a dramatic point of view, but it also creates a strange contradiction. By making the disaster so extreme, the movie sometimes weakens the very warning it wants to deliver. A viewer who already understands climate issues might appreciate the intention behind it, but someone looking for a realistic explanation could easily dismiss the whole thing because the science feels too exaggerated. The film takes a serious subject and transforms it into a Hollywood survival story, which makes it entertaining but also less precise. There was also a lot of debate around the way the movie presents its environmental message. Some viewers felt it was an important wake-up call, while others felt it was too preachy or too obvious. The film doesn't really explore the complexity of climate change. It chooses a much simpler approach. Humans caused a problem, nature responds, and now humanity has to deal with the consequences. That simplicity can work in a 2-hour blockbuster, but it also means the movie misses opportunities. A more interesting version of this story could have explored how governments react, how societies change, or how ordinary people adapt when facing a worldwide crisis. Instead, the movie mostly uses climate change as the trigger for a survival adventure, but maybe that's also why the film has remained memorable. Even people who criticize the science often remember the feeling of watching New York disappear underwater, cities covered in ice, and humanity being completely powerless against nature. The message may not be scientifically perfect, but the basic idea behind it is easy to understand. The environment matters, and ignoring warning signs can have consequences. So is The Day After Tomorrow a realistic climate warning? Not really. It's too exaggerated for that. But as a piece of popular entertainment, it managed to bring environmental concerns into a mainstream conversation in a way few blockbuster movies had done before. The film's biggest weakness is that it sometimes confuses being dramatic with being meaningful. But its biggest success is that, even beneath all the Hollywood destruction, there is a genuine attempt to make audiences think about the relationship between humans and the planet. This is probably the biggest argument surrounding The Day After Tomorrow. How much of it should we actually take seriously? Because on one side, the movie is built around a real concern. Climate change is real, environmental damage is real, and the idea that human activity can affect the planet is not some fantasy concept. The film clearly wanted to tap into those fears and turn them into a disaster scenario that audiences could immediately understand. But then the movie takes that idea and pushes it into complete Hollywood territory. The biggest issue is the speed. In reality, climate systems are incredibly complex and changes happen over much longer periods of time. In this film, the planet almost seems to flip a switch. One moment people are debating climate warnings, and shortly afterward entire regions are experiencing impossible weather conditions. Temperatures collapse, storms appear on a massive scale, and cities become frozen landscapes within a very short period. That's where many viewers start questioning the logic. The movie isn't really interested in exploring the science in a realistic way. It uses scientific concepts as a starting point and then builds a giant disaster ride around them. The explanation is there, but mostly as a way to justify the next big visual sequence. And to be fair, that approach is common in disaster movies. Audiences don't usually walk into these films expecting a documentary. We know we're watching an exaggerated version of reality. The question is whether the movie can make that exaggeration feel believable enough to keep us invested. Sometimes The Day After Tomorrow succeeds. The idea of nature becoming something humanity cannot control is genuinely fascinating. Watching modern cities, technology, and infrastructure suddenly become powerless creates a strong sense of vulnerability. But other moments stretch the imagination too far. Characters survive situations that seem almost impossible. The geography doesn't always make sense. The idea of extreme cold moving through buildings like a physical force is visually interesting, but scientifically questionable. Scenes that are supposed to create tension sometimes end up making viewers think more about the logic behind them than the danger itself. The film walks a difficult line between science fiction and disaster fantasy. If you watch it expecting realistic climate science, you will probably spend most of the runtime noticing what doesn't work. But if you approach it as a large-scale catastrophe movie, the exaggerated elements become easier to accept. And that's really the strange balance of The Day After Tomorrow. The same thing that hurts it as a serious environmental film is what helps it work as a summer blockbuster. The science may be questionable, but the imagination behind the disaster is undeniably effective. The best disaster movies don't always succeed because every detail is accurate. They succeed because they make you feel the danger. This film may not convince you that this exact scenario could happen, but it does create a memorable image of a world where humanity suddenly realizes it is not in control. So scientifically, The Day After Tomorrow has plenty of problems, but as a piece of cinematic spectacle, it understands one important thing. Sometimes the fear of a disaster is just as powerful as the disaster itself. When talking about The Day After Tomorrow, it's impossible to separate the movie from the filmmaker behind it. Roland Emmerich has built an entire career around one particular kind of cinematic experience. Taking something familiar, whether it's a city, a country, or even the entire planet, and then imagining what it would look like if everything suddenly went wrong. That style was already obvious in his earlier films. Emmerich has always been drawn to large-scale destruction, huge visual moments, and situations where ordinary people are forced to survive impossible circumstances. He isn't usually making small, intimate stories. His movies are built around the feeling of watching something massive unfold in front of you, and The Day After Tomorrow fits perfectly into that approach. Instead of aliens or futuristic threats, the enemy here is nature itself. But the filmmaking style remains the same. Emmerich takes the biggest possible scenario and asks, how far can we push this? The result is a movie filled with collapsing environments, extreme weather, and images designed to leave an impression. That's both what makes him effective and what makes him frustrating. On one hand, there are very few directors who can create this kind of scale. Emmerich understands how to make a disaster feel visually overwhelming. He knows where to place the camera, how to build anticipation, and how to create those moments where you simply watch the screen and think, how did they even make this? But on the other hand, his focus on spectacle often comes at the expense of smaller details. Characters can sometimes feel like they exist mainly to move from one disaster sequence to the next. The story becomes a vehicle for destruction rather than the other way around. That criticism has followed many of Emmerich's films. He has often been described as a filmmaker more interested in the event itself than the deeper consequences of that event. The cities falling apart, the landmarks being destroyed, the world changing, those moments are usually what people remember most. And honestly, that is exactly why his movies continue to attract audiences. There is something strangely satisfying about watching a director fully commit to a ridiculous idea. Emmerich doesn't approach these stories halfway. He doesn't give us a small storm or a limited crisis. He goes straight for the biggest version possible. In The Day After Tomorrow, that means turning climate change into a worldwide survival event. The realism may be questionable, but the ambition is undeniable. The movie is very much a product of Emmerich's filmmaking philosophy, bigger, louder, and more visual. If you are looking for a carefully grounded scientific thriller, this probably isn't the movie for you. But if you enjoy disaster cinema, where the entire world becomes the stage, Emmerich knows exactly how to deliver that experience. Ultimately, The Day After Tomorrow represents both sides of Roland Emmerich as a director. He can create unforgettable cinematic images and make audiences feel the scale of a catastrophe, but he can also leave viewers wishing that the characters and story received the same level of attention as the destruction around them. If there is one area where The Day After Tomorrow still earns a lot of respect, it's the visual effects. In many ways, the effects are the reason this movie has remained memorable long after its release. Released in 2004, this was a time when digital effects were improving rapidly, but filmmakers were still figuring out how far they could push computer-generated environments. Looking back now, some parts may not look as flawless as modern blockbusters, but the ambition behind the visuals is impressive. The movie doesn't just show a storm or a disaster happening in one location. It tries to make the entire planet feel like it is changing at once. We jump from one extreme event to another, massive waves hitting New York, tornadoes tearing through Los Angeles, cities disappearing under snow and ice, and landscapes being completely transformed by the weather. The opening sequence alone sets the tone. Watching the ice shelf break apart immediately tells you what kind of movie you are about to experience. It's not subtle, but it grabs your attention. The New York scenes are where the film really finds its identity. Seeing one of the world's most recognizable cities flooded, abandoned, and eventually frozen creates some of the movie's strongest imagery. The streets filled with water, the ship moving through Manhattan, the Statue of Liberty surrounded by destruction. These are the kinds of images that stay with viewers because they take something familiar and completely change it. The tornado sequence in Los Angeles is another standout moment. The destruction is exaggerated, obviously, but the scale of it is what makes it entertaining. The film understands that disaster movies are often about the feeling of witnessing something impossible. And that is where the visual effects succeed. They are not always there to convince you that every scientific detail is realistic. They are there to create a sense of awe and danger. Of course, impressive visuals cannot completely hide the movie's weaknesses. A spectacular disaster scene can grab your attention, but it cannot fix weak dialogue or underdeveloped characters. There are moments where the effects are carrying the entire movie because the story itself isn't strong enough. Still, credit has to be given to the artists and technical teams behind the film. Creating an entire frozen world, destroying major cities, and making global weather disasters feel believable on screen was a huge challenge, especially at that time. The funny thing about The Day After Tomorrow is that even many of its biggest critics usually agree on one point: it looks great. People may argue about the science, the writing, or the characters, but the imagery is hard to forget. This is a movie where the disaster itself almost becomes the main character. The storms, the ice, and the collapsing environments are what drive the experience. And even if the story doesn't always reach the same level as its visuals, the spectacle remains the reason many viewers still return to it. Because at the end of the Day After Tomorrow understood something very simple about blockbuster filmmaking. Sometimes audiences just want to see something they have never seen before. And when it comes to creating that sense of scale, the movie still has moments that are genuinely impressive. One of the most noticeable things about The Day After Tomorrow is that it almost feels like two different movies connected together. The first half is where the film is at its strongest. It moves with confidence, building the disaster piece by piece. We get the warnings, the scientific discussions, the strange weather events, and then the situation starts spiraling out of control. There's a real sense that something enormous is coming, and the movie does a good job creating that anticipation. The opening moments especially work because they make the audience curious. You're watching signs that something is wrong before the rest of the world fully understands it. The ice breaking, the weather patterns changing, the sudden escalation of events, it creates a feeling of watching a disaster slowly reveal itself. Then the movie starts delivering the spectacle people came to see. The tornadoes in Los Angeles, the flooding of New York, the chaos spreading across different parts of the world. This section of the film has energy. It feels like a genuine global crisis. There is a sense of scale, and for a while, The Day After Tomorrow feels like it could become one of the great modern disaster movies. But once the major destruction begins to settle down, the movie changes direction. The second half becomes much more focused on survival and the journey to save Jack's son, Sam. Instead of watching the world react to a massive catastrophe, we spend more time following a smaller group of characters trying to stay alive. That shift isn't necessarily a bad idea. Many classic disaster films do the same thing. After showing the disaster itself, they focus on human stories because audiences need someone to connect with. The problem is that here, the personal drama doesn't always feel strong enough to carry the movie. Jack's journey across the frozen landscape has some memorable moments, but it doesn't have the same urgency as the first half. After watching entire cities being destroyed, a smaller survival mission can feel strangely limited. The pacing also becomes uneven. The first half constantly gives you something new to process. Every few minutes there is another discovery, another warning sign, another major event. The second half slows down considerably, and some viewers may feel like the movie loses the momentum it built so well. There is also a feeling that the film spends less time exploring the aftermath of the disaster than it could have. A worldwide catastrophe like this creates countless interesting possibilities: how governments respond, how people adapt, how society changes, but the story stays mostly focused on the rescue mission. Still, the second half isn't without its strengths. The library survival scenes create some of the film's most human moments, and the father-son connection gives the movie an emotional reason to continue beyond just destruction. The problem is that the first half sets such a high bar. Once you've seen cities being swallowed by storms and frozen in seconds, it becomes difficult for anything else to match that level of excitement. Ultimately, The Day After Tomorrow is a movie where the beginning promises more than the rest can fully deliver. The first half feels like a massive global event unfolding before your eyes. The second half becomes a more traditional survival adventure. Both sides have their moments, but the contrast between them is impossible to ignore. The film starts as a world-ending spectacle and finishes as a much smaller story about a family trying to make it through the aftermath. The biggest weakness of The Day After Tomorrow has always been the screenplay. The movie has a fascinating idea, impressive visuals, and a strong sense of scale, but when you look beyond the destruction, the actual story is much more familiar than the concept suggests. The structure follows a formula that disaster movies have used for decades. There is the scientist nobody listens to, the warning that comes too late, the authorities realizing the danger after it has already begun, and ordinary people suddenly forced into impossible situations. None of these elements are automatically bad. In fact, disaster movies often work because audiences understand this formula. We know the world is going to fall apart, we know characters will be separated, and we know there will be moments where survival seems impossible. The enjoyment comes from seeing how the film handles those familiar ingredients. The problem is that The Day After Tomorrow rarely does anything unexpected with them. The screenplay often feels like it is moving from one disaster checklist item to the next. A major storm, check. A dangerous escape, check. A heroic sacrifice, check. A last-minute rescue, check. The movie knows exactly what kind of experience it wants to provide, but sometimes it feels like it is following the rules of the genre rather than creating its own identity. The dialogue is another area where the script struggles. Some conversations feel overly obvious, almost as if the characters are explaining the message directly to the audience instead of naturally talking to each other. The film has serious ideas about climate change, responsibility, and human survival, but the writing doesn't always trust viewers enough to understand those themes without being told. There are also moments where the story asks the audience to accept too many coincidences. Characters survive situations that seem incredibly convenient, and certain events happen at exactly the right moment to keep the plot moving. In a movie this exaggerated, some level of coincidence is expected, but the screenplay sometimes pushes that too far. At the same time, it's worth acknowledging what the script does well. The basic structure is easy to follow. The movie never becomes confusing, and the central motivation is simple. Jack wants to reach his son. That straightforward emotional goal gives the chaos a clear direction. You always understand what the characters are trying to achieve. And sometimes simplicity works. Not every disaster movie needs complicated storytelling or deep philosophical ideas. There is a certain appeal in a film that simply says, here is a massive problem, here are people trying to survive it. The issue is that The Day After Tomorrow has a premise that could have supported a much richer story. A worldwide climate disaster opens the door to exploring politics, human behavior, social change, and the consequences of ignoring warnings. Instead, the screenplay mostly uses that concept as a foundation for a survival adventure. So is the screenplay terrible? Not exactly. It's functional. It does its job of moving the characters from one disaster sequence to another, but it also feels like a missed opportunity because the movie's central idea is far more interesting than the story built around it. In the end, the screenplay is a perfect example of what makes The Day After Tomorrow such a mixed experience. The foundation is strong, the ambition is there, and the concept is genuinely intriguing. But the writing never reaches the same level as the movie's biggest ideas or its visual imagination. For a movie built around a global catastrophe, The Day After Tomorrow actually spends a surprising amount of time away from the destruction and focuses on its characters. The problem is that the characters are not always as interesting as the disaster happening around them. At the center of the story is Jack Hall, played by Dennis Quaid. Jack is the kind of movie scientist we have seen many times before, intelligent, determined, and constantly trying to convince people that something terrible is coming. Quaid brings a certain level of seriousness to the role, and he gives Jack a believable sense of urgency. Even when the script gives him some questionable moments, Quaid commits to the character. He sells the idea of a father who is willing to cross a frozen country because he refuses to abandon his son. That emotional motivation is simple, but it works. However, the character itself is not particularly complex. Jack is mostly defined by his mission. We know he is smart, we know he cares about his family, and we know he is determined, but the movie doesn't spend much time exploring who he is beyond those qualities. Jake Gyllenhaal plays Sam Hall, Jack's son, and this is an interesting look back at one of his earlier major roles. Sam is the younger character caught in the middle of the disaster, trapped in New York while waiting for help to arrive. Gyllenhaal gives the role some natural charm and vulnerability, especially in the quieter survival scenes. The challenge is that Sam's character is written in a fairly standard way. He is the young person who has to prove himself, survive against impossible odds, and eventually reconnect with his father. Gyllenhaal does what he can with the material, but the writing doesn't give him a huge amount of depth to work with. Emmy Rossum brings energy to her role as Laura, and she helps make the group of survivors feel more human. Ian Holm, meanwhile, adds some much-needed experience and professionalism. Even in a movie where the science and logic are constantly being questioned, Holmes' performance gives certain scenes more weight. The supporting cast overall is solid, but the bigger issue is that many characters feel like they exist mainly to serve the disaster. They are there to react to the next threat, rather than having fully developed personalities and personal journeys. That's where the movie struggles compared with the best disaster films. The strongest examples of the genre understand that the destruction is only half the story. The audience needs to care about the people experiencing it. A collapsing building or a massive storm can create excitement, but emotional investment comes from the characters. The Day After Tomorrow gets close to that idea, especially through Jack's search for Sam, but it never fully develops those relationships beyond the basic setup. Still, the performances do help the movie more than the script sometimes allows. Quaid brings enough heart to make Jack's mission believable. Gyllenhaal gives Sam a quiet determination, and the supporting actors provide moments of genuine humanity in between the larger disaster sequences. The characters may not be unforgettable, but they are not the reason the movie fails either. They are caught somewhere in the middle, good enough to keep the story moving, but not strong enough to compete with the massive spectacle happening around them. For all the massive storms, collapsing cities, and world-ending imagery in The Day After Tomorrow, the movie is ultimately built around a much smaller story, a father trying to reach his son. That relationship between Jack and Sam is supposed to be the emotional center of the film. While the entire planet is falling apart, Jack's motivation stays incredibly personal. He is not trying to save the world. He is not leading some grand mission to stop the disaster. He is simply trying to find his son and bring him home, and there is something effective about that choice. Disaster movies can sometimes become so focused on destruction that the human side gets lost. By giving Jack a personal reason to keep moving forward, the movie gives the audience something simple to hold onto. The frozen landscapes and impossible weather conditions become more than just visual effects because there is a person at the center of it who has everything to lose. Dennis Quaid sells that determination well. Even when the situation becomes completely unrealistic, he plays Jack with enough sincerity that you understand his desperation. His journey across the country is physically impossible in many ways, but emotionally, the idea is easy to connect with. Most parents can understand the instinct behind it. When your child is in danger, you do whatever you can. The interesting thing is that the movie introduces Jack and Sam as two people who are not necessarily close at the beginning. Their relationship has some distance. Jack is often consumed by his work, and Sam is carrying some frustration about feeling disconnected from his father. That could have been a really interesting emotional layer. A story about a father who spends years trying to warn the world while struggling to connect with his own family has a lot of potential. The movie hints at that conflict, but it doesn't explore it as deeply as it could have. Once the disaster begins, the emotional complexity mostly gets pushed aside in favor of survival. Sam's side of the relationship also has room for more development. Being trapped in New York gives him his own survival journey, and there are moments where he shows courage and leadership. But the screenplay often treats him more as someone Jack needs to rescue rather than a character going through his own transformation. The best disaster movies understand that the personal story should be just as powerful as the disaster itself. The audience should care about whether the characters survive, not only because they are in danger, but because their journey means something. The Day After Tomorrow gets some of that right, especially in the simple emotional idea behind Jack's mission. The image of a father walking through a frozen world just to reach his son is genuinely powerful. But the movie never fully earns the emotional impact it is aiming for. The relationship is more of a foundation than a deeply explored storyline. We understand the love between them, but we don't always feel the history, the conflict, and the emotional weight behind it. Still, that father-son connection is what keeps the movie from becoming just another collection of disaster scenes. Without Jack's search for Sam, the film would mostly be about storms, ice, and destruction. Their relationship gives the chaos a human reason. It may not be as developed as it could have been, but it is the heart that keeps The Day After Tomorrow moving beneath all the spectacle. When people remember The Day After Tomorrow, they usually don't start by talking about the dialogue or the character development. They remember the moments when the world starts falling apart. And that is where the movie understands exactly what it wants to be. The disaster sequences are the main attraction, and the film wastes very little time showing the audience what kind of destruction it has in mind. Instead of focusing on one isolated event, it creates the feeling of a planet-wide collapse happening all at once. Every part of the world seems to be facing its own nightmare. The tornado sequence in Los Angeles is one of the earliest examples of the movie going all in. It takes a familiar city landscape and turns it into chaos within seconds. The destruction is exaggerated, but that exaggeration is part of the appeal. Watching a place everyone recognizes become completely powerless against nature creates a strange sense of scale. Then there is New York, which is probably where the movie reaches its peak. The flooding of Manhattan is still one of the most memorable parts of the film. Seeing water rush through the streets, buildings surrounded by waves, and a familiar city transformed into something almost unrecognizable gives the movie some of its strongest imagery. The sequence works because it combines spectacle with survival. It's not just about seeing a city destroyed, it's about watching people try to escape while everything they know is disappearing around them. The library scenes are another important part of the film because they slow things down and bring the disaster closer to the characters. Instead of watching destruction from a distance, we see ordinary people trapped, trying to stay warm, make decisions, and figure out how to survive. Those smaller moments are actually where the movie creates some of its best tension. The idea of a group of people trapped inside a building while the outside world becomes unlivable is simple, but effective. The danger feels more personal because the characters are not fighting against a giant wave or a tornado anymore. They are fighting time, temperature, and their own limited resources. Of course, some survival moments stretch credibility. The movie asks viewers to accept situations that are almost impossible, and there are several moments where characters survive mainly because the story needs them to. The closer the film gets to extreme conditions, the more some viewers may question the logic behind what they are seeing. But disaster movies often work on emotion more than realism. The purpose of these scenes is not always to create a scientifically accurate survival simulation. It is to create suspense, fear, and the feeling that the characters are facing something beyond human control. And in that sense, The Day After Tomorrow succeeds more often than it fails. The movie has a strong understanding of visual escalation. It starts with unusual weather events, moves toward widespread destruction, and eventually creates a world where survival itself becomes the challenge. Each sequence tries to raise the stakes higher than the previous one. The problem is that the disaster scenes are sometimes so much more interesting than the human story surrounding them. The storms, floods, and freezing temperatures have more personality than many of the characters. You are often more curious about what nature will do next than what happens to the people caught inside it. But that is also why the movie remains entertaining. Even with all its flaws, the destruction sequences deliver exactly what audiences came for. They are ambitious, memorable, and filled with the kind of large-scale imagery that defines the disaster genre. The Day After Tomorrow may not always convince you, but when the world starts collapsing, it knows how to make you look. One of the biggest missed opportunities in The Day After Tomorrow is that the movie has a much larger story hiding inside its own premise. The idea itself is enormous. This is not just a disaster affecting one city or one group of people. The entire planet is changing. Governments are struggling. Millions of people are facing an unprecedented crisis, and the way humanity responds could have been just as interesting as the disaster itself. But the movie mostly chooses to stay with one family. And to be fair, that choice is not automatically wrong. A massive disaster can become emotionally overwhelming if there is no personal story to connect with. Focusing on Jack and Sam gives the audience a clear emotional point of view. Instead of trying to follow the entire world, we follow one father trying to save his son. The problem is that the movie's own premise feels too big for such a narrow focus. There are moments where you start wondering about everything happening beyond the main characters. How are other countries responding? What happens to governments? How do ordinary people adapt when the world they know completely changes? What happens when society itself has to rebuild? Those questions are fascinating, but the film rarely explores them. The movie gives us glimpses of the larger situation. We see different parts of the world experiencing disasters, we see leaders trying to respond, and we see the consequences of the catastrophe. But these moments are mostly there to remind us of the scale, rather than actually explore it. A more ambitious version of this story could have balanced the personal and global sides together. Imagine spending more time with different groups of survivors, scientists trying to understand what is happening, governments making impossible decisions, or communities dealing with the aftermath. That kind of approach could have made the disaster feel even more powerful because it would show not just the destruction, but the human consequences behind it. Instead, once the main disaster begins, the film becomes a fairly traditional survival story. Jack's journey matters, but the world-changing event happening around him often feels like background scenery for his mission. There is an interesting contrast here. The movie wants us to believe we are witnessing the biggest crisis in human history, but emotionally, it remains a very small story. The stakes are global, but the focus is personal. Again, that is not necessarily a weakness. Some of the greatest disaster films succeed because they use a huge event to tell a simple human story. The problem is that The Day After Tomorrow has a concept that invites deeper exploration, and it leaves a lot of that potential untouched. The film gives us the image of a world in crisis, but it rarely shows what that crisis does to humanity as a whole. And maybe that is the most frustrating thing about it. The destruction is impressive, the idea is fascinating, and the possibilities are endless. But instead of exploring a civilization-changing event, the movie mostly becomes a story about one father trying to cross a frozen landscape. That emotional journey works on a basic level, but the larger story it could have told might have been even more interesting. The Day After Tomorrow shows us the end of the world as we know it, but it doesn't spend enough time asking what comes next. One of the strangest things about The Day After Tomorrow is that it is never completely clear what kind of movie it wants to be. On one side, it is trying to be a serious warning about climate change and the consequences of ignoring environmental problems. The characters talk about global danger, governments face impossible decisions, and the entire planet is supposedly entering a catastrophic new era. But then, almost immediately, the movie gives us moments that feel much more like classic popcorn entertainment. That contrast creates a very unusual tone. There are scenes that are clearly meant to be dramatic, people running for their lives, cities being destroyed, characters making emotional sacrifices, but because the situations become so extreme, some moments end up feeling unintentionally funny. The problem is not necessarily that the movie has humor. Many disaster films need lighter moments. A little comedy can give the audience a break from constant tension and make the characters feel more human. The issue is that The Day After Tomorrow often creates humor simply because the situation becomes too unbelievable. When characters are dealing with impossible weather conditions, strange survival choices, or dramatic speeches that feel a little too serious, the audience can sometimes find themselves reacting differently than the movie intended. Instead of feeling nervous, they might find themselves questioning the logic of what is happening, and that is where the film's exaggerated style becomes a double-edged sword. The same larger-than-life approach that makes the destruction exciting also makes some emotional moments harder to take seriously. The movie wants you to feel the weight of the disaster, but sometimes the sheer absurdity of the situation makes that difficult. There are also moments where the dialogue contributes to this. Some lines feel very much like they belong in a big early 2000s blockbuster, dramatic, direct, and designed to deliver the message clearly. They are not subtle, and depending on your taste, that can either be part of the fun or a major distraction. But there is also something charming about that old-school blockbuster energy. The Day After Tomorrow does not try to hide what it is. It is not a quiet, realistic survival drama. It is a movie where a scientist races through a frozen America, cities are swallowed by extreme weather, and the world is transformed in the most cinematic way possible. That level of exaggeration can be frustrating if you are looking for realism, but entertaining if you accept the movie on its own terms. In a way, the film almost exists in two different worlds. It wants to make you think about serious environmental issues, but it also wants you to enjoy the spectacle of watching landmarks destroyed and impossible disasters unfold. Sometimes those two sides work together. Other times they clash, but that clash is also part of why the movie remains memorable. Even viewers who criticize the science or the writing often remember specific scenes, strange moments, and the unique experience of watching a disaster movie that takes itself extremely seriously while occasionally becoming unintentionally hilarious. The Day After Tomorrow may not always create the emotions it aims for, but it certainly creates a reaction. Whether you find it thrilling, ridiculous, or somewhere in between, it is rarely a movie people completely forget. When you place The Day After Tomorrow next to other disaster movies, one thing becomes pretty obvious. It knows exactly what tradition it belongs to. This is very much the kind of film built from the same DNA as older catastrophe movies. You've got the warning nobody takes seriously, a huge event that changes everything, people separated from their families, impossible survival situations, and eventually that familiar question of who makes it out and who doesn't. So no, the formula itself was never especially new. You can feel echoes of films like The Poseidon Adventure, Earthquake, Twister, Deep Impact, Armageddon, even Independence Day in the way the story is structured. Different threats, obviously, but the rhythm is familiar. Set up the danger, unleash the spectacle, scatter the characters, then narrow everything down to survival. What The Day After Tomorrow does differently is swap aliens, volcanoes, meteors, or mechanical destruction for climate itself. And that actually gives it a distinct identity. There is something about extreme weather that makes the disaster feel more unsettling because there's no villain to defeat. Nobody can punch the storm. Nobody can negotiate with freezing temperatures. The characters are basically waiting for nature to finish whatever it has started, which gives the movie a slightly different kind of helplessness. At the same time, Roland Emmerich's fingerprints are all over it. If Independence Day showed how much he enjoyed destroying recognizable landmarks, this film takes that impulse and applies it to the planet's weather systems. New York gets flooded, Los Angeles gets torn apart by tornadoes, ice covers entire regions. The movie practically moves from one postcard image to the next asking, okay, how do we destroy this one? That sounds cynical, but it is also part of the fun. There is a very specific pleasure in old-school disaster movies where the spectacle is almost the whole point. You know the characters are going to make questionable decisions. You know the science might not survive close inspection. You know there will probably be some heroic sacrifice at exactly the right moment. You accept all of that because you came to watch civilization have an extremely bad day, and The Day After Tomorrow understands that bargain. What is interesting is how well the movie has stuck around compared with a lot of other effects-heavy blockbusters from the same period. Some viewers still consider it one of the defining disaster movies of the 2000s. Others think it is ridiculous, cliched, and completely disposable. Weirdly, both reactions make sense. It is ridiculous. It is also memorable. That matters more than people sometimes admit. Plenty of technically competent disaster movies come and go without leaving much behind. The Day After Tomorrow, for all its flaws, gave audiences images they remembered. The flooded Manhattan streets, the ship sitting in the city, the frozen Statue of Liberty, the tornadoes ripping through Los Angeles. Even people who dislike the movie can usually remember something from it. That's probably why comparisons with later disaster films keep coming up. Movies like 2012 pushed destruction even further, while other apocalypse films found different ways to end civilization. But The Day After Tomorrow still has this slightly cleaner, more recognizable identity. Climate catastrophe, sudden ice age, father searching for son. You can describe the movie in one sentence and almost everyone knows exactly which film you mean. There's also a nostalgic quality to it now. It belongs to that era of blockbuster filmmaking, where movies could be completely sincere about ridiculous material. There is very little irony here. The film believes in its speeches, its heroic moments, its emotional reunions, and its giant walls of water. That earnestness can make it cheesy, sure, but it also gives it personality, and I think that is where its legacy really sits. The Day After Tomorrow probably isn't the smartest disaster movie. It isn't the most realistic, and it definitely isn't the most subtle. But within the genre, it became one of those movies people keep returning to. Rainy day movie, weekend movie, nostalgia movie, switch your brain off movie. It fits comfortably into all of those categories. Sometimes a genre film survives because it reinvented cinema. Sometimes it survives because it gave people exactly the kind of experience they wanted and did it in a way they never quite forgot. The Day After Tomorrow falls much closer to the second category. Few movies create such a clear divide between critics and audiences as The Day After Tomorrow. When it was released, the reaction was all over the place. Some people saw it as a ridiculous blockbuster filled with bad science, predictable characters, and exaggerated disaster scenarios. Others looked past those flaws and simply enjoyed it for what it was, a big, loud, entertaining disaster movie. And honestly, both sides have a point. The criticism is easy to understand. The science is heavily exaggerated, the dialogue can be very obvious, and the story follows a familiar formula. For viewers expecting a realistic climate thriller or a deeply emotional drama, the movie can feel disappointing. The film introduces a fascinating idea, but it does not always explore it with the depth some people expected. But then there is the audience that connected with the movie because of the experience it provides. For many viewers, The Day After Tomorrow was never about scientific accuracy. It was about seeing something impossible happen on a massive screen. Watching cities flood, storms destroy landscapes, and the world transform into an icy wasteland was the main attraction. That kind of spectacle has a lasting appeal. A lot of the movie's fans also have a nostalgic connection to it. People who watched it when they were younger often remember it as one of those films that made a huge impression. Seeing it again years later can bring back memories of watching it in theaters, discovering disaster movies for the first time, or simply being amazed by the scale of what was happening on screen. And interestingly, many people who revisit the film later still find themselves enjoying it, even while admitting its flaws. That is probably the most accurate way to describe the movie's reputation today. It is not a film that became beloved because everyone agreed it was perfect. It became memorable because it delivered a specific feeling. There is something comforting about returning to a movie where you already know what is coming. You know when the disasters begin, you know the major set pieces, and you know where the story is heading. But the combination of visuals, music, and that early 2000s blockbuster atmosphere can still make it an enjoyable watch. Of course, rewatch value depends heavily on what you want from the movie. If you focus on realism, logic, and character development, the flaws become more obvious every time. The impossible science, convenient survival moments, and simple storytelling stand out. But if you watch it as a disaster spectacle, it still works surprisingly well. The destruction remains impressive, the pacing keeps things moving, and the movie has a certain charm that many modern blockbusters sometimes lack. That is the interesting thing about The Day After Tomorrow. It is a film that people often criticize and defend at the same time. Someone can say the science is ridiculous and still admit the movie is fun. Someone can point out the weak writing and still remember the frozen New York scenes years later. Not every movie survives because it is flawless. Some movies survive because they create an experience people remember, and that is where The Day After Tomorrow has found its audience. It may never be considered a masterpiece of disaster cinema, but nearly 2 decades later, it remains one of those movies people continue to talk about, revisit, and argue over, which, for a summer blockbuster, is its own kind of success. So where does The Day After Tomorrow finally land? For me, it's one of those movies where the flaws are impossible to ignore, but somehow they don't completely ruin the experience. The science is shaky, the screenplay is simple. A lot of the characters are thinly written, and some of the survival situations are so convenient that you just have to accept them and move on. If you stop every few minutes to question how any of this is supposed to work, the movie can fall apart pretty quickly. But if you meet it on its own level, there is still a lot to enjoy. The biggest reason is obvious: the spectacle works. The tornadoes, the flooding, the frozen cities, the enormous storms, those are the images the movie was built around, and they remain its strongest material. Even now, there are sequences that still have real scale to them, and that matters because The Day After Tomorrow never pretends to be a small movie. Everything is exaggerated: the weather, the emotions, the speeches, the danger. Roland Emmerich takes a serious environmental concern and turns it into a giant survival blockbuster, sometimes thoughtfully, sometimes ridiculously. That mix is basically the whole movie. There are moments where it genuinely works as suspense. Then there are moments where you start noticing the logic and have to laugh a little. There are scenes where the climate message feels effective, followed by others where the exaggeration makes that same message harder to take seriously. The human side is similar. Jack's determination to reach Sam gives the film a clear emotional center, but the relationship never becomes as powerful as the movie seems to want it to be. Dennis Quaid and Jake Gyllenhaal help sell it, and the supporting cast does solid work, but the characters are always competing with the weather for your attention, and the weather usually wins. That might sound like a major criticism, but in a disaster film like this, maybe it isn't entirely a bad thing. There are movies you remember because of brilliant dialogue, others because of unforgettable characters. The Day After Tomorrow is remembered because you can still picture New York disappearing beneath a wall of water or the Statue of Liberty sitting in a frozen wasteland. Those images became the movie. Would a stronger screenplay have made it better? Absolutely. More believable science, deeper characters, and a little more attention to the global consequences could have turned this into something much richer. Instead, what we got is a very polished piece of disaster entertainment with more ambition in its visuals than in its writing. And strangely, that's probably why it has aged the way it has. It's easy to criticize, but it's also easy to rewatch. You know the story. You know how ridiculous parts of it are. You know the movie is going to choose the biggest possible version of every situation. And yet when the storms start building, it still pulls you in. That counts for something. The Day After Tomorrow is not a great film because of its realism, and it is definitely not a great film because of its subtlety. It works because it understands spectacle. It takes one terrifying idea, blows it up to blockbuster proportions, and commits to it completely. Sometimes that leads to genuinely impressive filmmaking. Sometimes it leads to nonsense. Most of the time, it lands somewhere entertainingly in between. So yes, spectacle over substance is probably the fairest way to describe it. but that doesn't automatically make it worthless. For viewers who love disaster movies, there is still a lot here to enjoy: huge set pieces, memorable imagery, a straightforward survival story, and enough early 2000s blockbuster energy to carry the weaker moments. It's messy. It's exaggerated, it's frequently unbelievable, but boring, not really. And for a movie whose main goal is to make you watch the world freeze over for 2 hours, that may be enough.